Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Big Picture, Information Governance for M365 and Beyond. We're excited that you've been able to join us for today's session. My name is Marissa Wharton with ActiveNav, and without further ado, I'd like to pass the mic to our presenter today. Andrew, it's over to you.
Thanks, Marissa. Hi, folks. My name is Andrew Cowan. I'm the product owner for the Discovery Center software at ActiveNav, and I'm going to walk you through a few ideas and concepts around information governance and 365, and sort of from the perspective of our product. But we're certainly happy to talk about all kinds of different use cases that you might find in your environment. I guess we have to start off with a sort of funny little slide. Marissa put this into our deck, and I tried to figure out which one of those guys I am, and I'm not really sure. But I guess the challenge that we have, a lot of our customers have, is that there's so much stuff out there. There's so much data in all kinds of different repositories, and they don't have a good handle on what all those repositories are. They may have the regulatory or the business requirements to be in charge of it, or to handle it, or to govern that information, but there's just so much of it, it becomes a challenge, a little bit overwhelming. Hopefully we can find some solutions to that kind of stuff. But we'll start at the start, which is kind of an interesting thing for a software company to talk about, but we're going to talk about where does your governance come from? Why do you do it? And how does that frame the way you approach the projects and programs around information governance? The very first thing is to understand the business about why do you have these policies and frameworks in place? Why is your business even asking you to bother to do these things? Nobody's going to do this for fun. Nobody loves governing information just for the sake of it. There has to be justifications for it. There's usually some kind of regulatory requirement or legislative requirement or business requirement that comes from the corporate rules in handling this information. So understanding that as the groundwork, the basis for where all of this flows from is really important, and and that gives you the grounding for talking to your stakeholders and making sure everybody's aligned along that same set of goals, making sure that everybody knows why the program's in place, what you're trying to aim for, and making sure that you have that touchstone to go back to. Everybody understands where it comes from, so that going forward with all the decisions that you make after that come back from the same place, that is all pushing and pulling in the same direction, that you all have those common goals in mind as you push forward with that. Building the program around sorry, just like my phone's ringing for some reason. Probably a spam call, I'm sure of it. Building a program around these kinds of things that ties those business goals to the actual lines of business that run inside your organization, about how those different parts of the business work, how they handle the data to get their jobs done, and how those business goals for the governance of that information, how those kinds of things can align, and in some cases how they don't align, because sometimes as you go through these processes, you can find conflicts between the way the business is run and the way the business says it should be run. So you can often find yourselves in a little bit of conflict there about working through how you're going to implement some of these programs, and then dealing with what your priorities are. That's probably the hardest thing. Like we saw with the picture of Buzz and Andy there, it's a bit of a surprise sometimes about how much data there is, and how quickly you're going to be able to get through and establish some kind of a governance program on these kinds of things. But setting your priorities going to be driven by the business. A lot of the time there'll be some kind of an event that drives these kinds of decisions to implement information governance, or to rejig your information governance program, or to rework it in some way. There'll be some kind of like a business event, like an acquisition, merger, the divestiture, that kind of thing will trigger it. Sometimes it'll be a technology one. One of the things that we talk about a lot these days is migration into the cloud, into M365, and how that changes the way you manage the information that your organization takes care of, and how you govern that information. So there's often going to be some kind of an impetus about what the drivers are for making those changes, and who's going to have priority in terms of making sure that certain things line up, because there's going to be things that are not in your control when you decide how you're going to approach these kinds of things. So all of that kind of stuff kind of lays the groundwork for actually going ahead and starting your business, the information governance from a program or a project perspective. And ActiveNav has been very very busy in this space for quite a few years, where we look at managing information, specifically managing unstructured information, so documents, email messages, spreadsheets, presentations, those kinds of things. Files that live inside your organization, and using file analysis, identifying that content, looking at what it is in order to help with that governance piece. And it sort of goes through a fairly straightforward set of steps in order to make that happen, starting off with just understanding what's out there, the sort of deer in the headlights look that we had with Buzz and Andy there at the beginning. Woody, Andy's the kid. Brain's not working very well. So making an inventory of the information that you have, just to know how big the problem is, about where that information is stored. That is usually rather revealing for most of our customers. They're usually a little bit surprised by how much data they actually have, about how much they have to actually think about the bits and pieces about where data is stored and who manages it and who owns it. And one of the things that becomes very clear after doing a data discovery or data inventory is to understand what actual information is necessary to keep, and that can feel like a little bit of a sideways step in hitting those goals from your governance perspective. But what we found with a lot of our customers is that doing that data cleansing or taking care of the redundant, obsolete, and toxic data. Trivial data is another T. Sometimes you see two T's. Understanding that the amount of that information, understanding what you're going to actually do with it, what the rules are around how much of that data you can get rid of, what you absolutely have to get rid of, what can be stored in particular types of storage and where it goes. That process can really reduce the challenge of managing the information as you move down this path towards an information governance program. Many of our customers will find at about 25% of the data that they're storing, they can classify that as rot or information data that they can get rid of. I've seen some companies have seen that number go up to as high as 50%. One case it was 65%, which is amazing. A bunch of pack rats, I'm sure, at that particular place. But it's a really helpful step before you get down the path even further, to have a data cleansing step in your progress in your program as you go forward with information governance, just to reduce the amount of information that you have to manage, and to reduce the burden going forward with information governance. It also helps at this stage to flesh out all of the policies and procedures that your organization is going to need to have identified around the handling of this information that's either stale or no longer required, or whatever that particular reason for disposition might be. Having a policy that you can actually base it on real world understanding of the data that you have, and filling that out so that later on, when you're in sort of the steady state kind of land of information governance, you have a policy that you can point back to and say, we went through our data, here's the kinds of things that we found. We don't want to get into that place again. So we have some policies and some rules around how we're going to handle information that's no longer required by the organization, and what that means and how to handle it. So that it's a kind of, it feels like a little bit of a step sideways when you're talking about information governance, but it's a really useful thing to have going forward, when to reduce that burden and have some policies and rules you can point back to when the business comes back and says, why are we cleaning this up, or how do we clean this up? The next stage after that is to model the data. So this is figuring out how to identify that content. So lots of organizations will know how to look for things like PII or PHI. If you're in that kind of space, you'll know what those things are. So personal information, health information, financial information. There may be information about customers or about employees, those kinds of things. Those are fairly common things that we see across most of our customers. There's going to be some things around the regulated industries, well understood, easy to find inside the organization, with identifying that content and understanding what's supposed to happen to it. So being able to model those ones are fairly simple, but also going through that information that's a little more challenging because there won't be specific industry rules or guidance to follow in that space. And those are going to be things that are very particular for your business or for your lines of business about how they do their work, and the kinds of bits of information that are important to your industry, to your organization, those crown jewels. How do you identify them? How do you make sure you understand that you've caught all of that information that you've got? And that's the data modeling piece. And that's identifying content based on where it's stored, the format that it's in. The age of the data can actually be quite interesting when it comes to the data modeling piece, as well as looking for particular content inside documents or spreadsheets or whatever kinds of files that might be there. Being able to model that data so that when you are completing that identification stage of the information, you have a good understanding of what kind of information is stored in what locations in your organization and how you want to handle it as you go forward. The metadata tagging stage is sort of something that you see in the sort of acquiring this data map, when you can understand that data model and understand where things are. But the metadata tagging piece allows you to sort of slice and dice the content, that data map, in ways that gives you insight into how that information is stored, where it's stored, where the crossovers between particular types of data might exist inside your organization, and how you want to manage that. Because there's going to be some stuff that might hit on PII, but it might also hit on financial information, or it might hit on PII and intellectual property information, for example. And you want to make sure that when you're going through this data modeling process, that you can actually reveal that information that kind of crosses over into different spaces and might be in different parts of the organization. So, or different parts of the business process and the information governance side of things. That idea of being able to tag that metadata inside of the applications that you use for doing this gives you the flexibility of changing the way you look at the information from different perspectives about how the information is being stored and how it's being handled. So maybe from an IT perspective, maybe from a security perspective, maybe from a regulatory perspective. So being able to look at that data in lots of different ways by using that metadata tagging of the information. So a document shows up in lots of different kinds of categories. It shows up in different contexts when you're looking at the information that you need to manage inside your domain. The next step is sort of one of the things that's kind of a hot topic, like I kind of mentioned earlier, and that's sort of the migration piece. What are you doing with this information? How are you handling it? Where are you going to put it? And what are the states that it's going to go through as you take it from one location to another location? That is very much a thing that has to happen in conjunction with the business, right? The people who actually use that data. Where does it live today? Did it move locations? A little bit around the IT side of the house. They're going to be making decisions about what kinds of repositories and how those things are managed, and the security side of that as well. Those are again, lots of stakeholders in the room where you talk about how do you migrate this information from one place to another, and then getting yourself into that sort of governance state where you have all of the information identified, understood, and you have the business pulling all in the same direction with the same basis for that governance to begin with, and putting that into business processes that give you the ability to report back to the organization on how the information is being managed, how it's being stored, being able to answer those regulatory questions if that kind of stuff comes up in the world that you live in. So that governance stuff. So using all of those things that we learned from those previous steps and building that into the governance stance or steady state that you get into that we're kind of aiming for. I talk a little bit about building your inventory, about what kinds of things can you learn from your content as you're looking in that. So different repositories have different structures. I mean, that's sounds a little bit kind of glib to say, but there's definitely going to be different ways that people use SharePoint, for example, or use network file shares, for example, or other kinds of content repositories in different ways, and understanding how those systems have grown, how they get used on a regular basis, how that the way they change as the organization goes through. A lot of the time, our customers will see certain areas in repositories for certain parts of the business grow stale over time as the organization kind of moves to a new way of handling that information. So being able to see a broad picture of across inventories and within a particular inventory about where that information is coming through and how it's being handled and how it's being managed. So being able to do that across multiple types of repositories, being able to do that across the depth of those repositories as well, being able to give you those results fairly quickly so that you're getting results within hours and days rather than months and weeks across different things, across different repositories. The other things that come back from those sort of very quick scans of content is who owns this data, what kind of data is the very sort of very basic metadata about a particular file can tell you a lot about when's the last time it got touched, when was it created, who was the owner when it got created, where it happens to live, the file type. We were talking to one of our customers recently, and they were finding documents from as far back as Word version 5, which was really interesting. It's sort of like Word version 5 hasn't been around for a very, very long time, and you sort of gives you a clue as to how stale that information is, how old that information is. Makes you wonder a little bit whether you're going to be able to handle that information. We've seen lots of customers migrate from one platform to another platform and leave data behind in different formats that are now no longer accessible because those applications don't exist anymore. So learning about the kind of information that exists and what state it's in, what accessibility you have to that content is kind of a useful thing to understand as well as you build that repository. That inventory of your data, and then taking that set of information and looking at who those people are that own the content, what those repository structures look like, can give you a very detailed overview, which sounds kind of weird, detailed overview, but lots of little bits of information about broad sets of the data without actually going in and opening up those files and understanding what the content in them. That gives you a very good map as to where you need to start focusing your energies. We talked before about priorities and which parts of the business you want to focus on, which parts of the repository, what's driving the current project that you're working on. But it also can tell you where your hotspots might be, or the areas within your repositories where you've got some problems and you need to know that you're going to have to spend some extra time on particular areas, or there's areas that you don't have to spend any time on because it's, all those documents that are in there are more than 20 years old, and we don't need to worry about those from a regulatory perspective. So we can ditch those off onto tapes and put them into cold storage, and we don't have to worry about them. So that inventory map gives you a good sense of where you need to start and what your roadmap is going to look like for when you go through the project of building up your governance program. The next bit is that I talked about before was that data model. So this is where you look at what are the things in your business you care about, what are the kinds of content that you care about, how is that content represented inside of documents, and how does that affect what your management style, the management process you're going to put in place for handling that information. So again, starting with the policy, your information governance policy, what's written down on paper, what legislation you have to deal with, what regulatory bodies you need to deal with, what kind of requirements your business is putting on the information governance, and that builds into what I'll call the extraction. So this is looking into the contents of the file. So there's sort of stuff we talked about before, which is basic tombstone-y kinds of information. What's the file name? Who's the owner? Where is it stored? What's the file type? That kind of stuff. Really easy to get, really fast to get. And then there's looking at the actual content itself. So taking the file, opening up and looking inside the content for those keywords, for those particular patterns that match the kinds of content that you're looking for. So like I said before, PII, PHI, tax information, financial information, specific business information inside your organization that might be important, like Project Bluebird. That's really important. We got to keep that, got to know where all that content is. So being able to take that extraction from that content and build that into a model for what your data looks like. Our tool, Discovery Center, comes with a couple of sort of side tools that help you to do that kind of stuff. One of them is called Workbench. It's one of those things, those screens that you see up there on the screen, which lets you look at all of the different facets of the information as you build out your data model. And we'll talk a little bit later when we talk about classification. This is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. It's what are the detailed bits of information inside of each document that we can retain and help us to build out that data map to not just be sort of a topographical map of where my data is and where my big mounds of data are, but also where are the really special bits of information. I have a big mound of information here. It might be big and there might be lots of information in that particular repository, but maybe it's all marketing fluff. Sorry, Marissa. It's lots of content that doesn't have any security concerns around it or doesn't carry any risk around it. It's something that you don't have to deal with right away. But maybe there's another repository which has less data in it, but has very specific, say, PII information, and you need to get that locked down. You need to handle that from a risk perspective. You need to worry about how you're going to handle that information more quickly than you would some other information. And this is how you can find that step out, by building a data model, understanding the kind of content you're looking for, and then being able to apply that data model to the content that's out there, giving you a good view of not just the shape, but also the risk or the reward in some cases of what the content you've got stored in your organization. So before I talk about an inventory, the content map is sort of the next stage on that, which is a little bit what I talked about before. It's like, okay, where are those bits and pieces of information being stored? How do they need to be handled? And giving you that detailed view on what's inside the content, not just what's overlaying it, but driving you towards an understanding of where your targets are for your information governance, so that if you need to, probably after you've done a stage here, you want to have an assessment of what's the priority you're trying to get through when you're dealing with this content. What when you're hitting those regulatory things, are you answering those questions in a timely fashion? Are you getting that information out of the content, out of the system that you need, and being able to show you over time in a particular location or across the estate, across your data estate, what's been changing over time. That is one of the things that is a kind of has been a challenge, I think, for a lot of our customers, is to be able to show the value that they're giving back to the organization for running through these kinds of programs. It can be very easy to give a report that says, well, we went from 10 petabytes of data down to 1 petabyte of data that we need to manage. That's a really valuable metric to see how much data is there. But once you've done that, first sort of cleanse on things, how are you continuing to provide that value? Are you reducing the risk of the information that's being stored, both from from a retention policy perspective, perhaps, to just plain old IT security? Where is the risky information being stored? How is it being protected? How's it being managed inside your organization? So that content map being a living, breathing kind of thing that changes over time as the governance program takes root and handles that information in a better way. How does that change from, maybe not day to day, but certainly from month to month, and definitely from year to year? Where were you last year? Where are you this year? How do you answer those regulatory questions? How do you answer the board questions about how you're handling risk of customer information, for example? A little bit about information classification. I talked earlier about the different facets or the different content types that you might run into inside the content that you find in your business. A lot of the time when we talk about classification, we talk about it from a security perspective. And that it can be a little bit blinding a bit when people start talking about classification and security and sensitivity about that information. It's important, but it's not the only way to classify information. There can certainly be information that's classified based on retention policies, or classified based on content type for which part of the business owns this information, or for particular customers or particular regions. If you're a global company, you've got different repositories with different kinds of information that you're allowed to store or not allowed to store. Understanding the many facets of that information comes back to that data map that we talked about. What kind of information are you interested in? what format does it take and where does it reside inside your content map after you've done it. So classification will often fall back to the sensitivity side of it, and we'll certainly talk about that as we move into the sort of M365 side of things a little bit. But there's also other ways to extend that classification idea to things that aren't just about sensitivity. And I think that's something that can get lost a lot of the time, especially when you're talking to the information security folks or even just the IT folks. That's the thing that they really latch onto. But there could be other aspects to content that is important just for how your business reacts to the regulatory environment that they live in, or how they want to do business, different business units inside the organization. So you've got all of this plethora of information about the different content inside your repositories and that you're in charge of taking care of. What do you do with it? How do you glean from that information? And that comes as part of the reporting piece. So taking that content, building your inventory, building your data model, building your data map, your content map, and then being able to, like I said before, slice and dice the information, looking at it from different perspectives. The screenshot that you see here, you can see it's talking about it from a security perspective. That could just as easily be what department does it belong to, which particular project, what region does it belong to, that sort of thing. But it gives you a way to look at that content, all the same content or specific pillars of that information. It could be information silos, it could be across different repositories as well, to give you insight into that content, be able to report on that information, print out the pretty graphs, show the trending of that information, and be able to give that both to the data owners, but also to the infrastructure folks to say, here's the problem that we need to tackle, here's how big the problem is, here's how deep the problem is, and here's the answers that we need to get about how do we handle that information. And then also being able to use those reports in order to report back to the governance board, to the organization, to say, here's where we are, and here's what we found, here's where we've gotten to, here's where we're going to be going next. So being able to report on that information as well. It's fine and dandy to have a big database full of all of the content, but you have to be able to slice and dice that information and be able to see it as you move forward with your governance program. So what do we do? Now we know all this stuff about our content. We know where it is. We know what the sensitivity of it is. We know the value that it has for the organization. We know the kinds of information, the regulatory impact that that information might have on the business. What do we do with that information? How do we handle it? And that comes down to the actioning side of things, what the actual governance part of it, right? So taking into account we're going to skip over the change part of it for a second and just move to the different kinds of things that people think about when they think about actioning. Certainly, the first one would be for disposition, right? So this is content that we do not need anymore, or we are not allowed to have anymore, and we need to get rid of it. So that's deleting stuff or quarantining it or writing it to tape, but like I said, and shipping it off to the cold storage, those kinds of things, so that you can handle the risk that's involved in some of that content, making sure that it's no longer a risk. You mitigate the risk just by deleting or removing that content from your repositories. The writing metadata stuff, we'll talk a little bit about that later when we talk about specifically about the MIP place, but it's also another way to be able to handle that content, to be able to give the content owners the ability to say something about that content. If there's maybe questions or you're not getting quite enough information out of the content itself, that you don't have a detailed enough business model or a data model in order to answer the questions about particular content, you can have the SMEs make decisions on those things as well. Give them the choice about how that information should be handled, how it should be treated, given different facets of the information. This needs to be stored on a particular type of server. This needs to be stored for a particular amount of time. This needs to be stored in a particular fashion and format. So that ability to store metadata, additional metadata that didn't come out of the actual content out of the repositories, but actually from SMEs who can go and look at that content and make decisions about things, whether that's in a grand sort of non-granular gross fashion where you're saying, well, I know everything in this folder and everything below that is super duper top secret and we have to treat it this way. That's very easy. Click the button and make it all be sorted in that way and have that metadata stored to be able to report on that information next time you go through the reporting process, or whether that's somebody actually going through and looking at each file. It's expensive and can be time consuming, but there are cases where you have to do that kind of thing, where you go through each content, each file, each document, and have a SME, subject matter expert, sorry, I should have said that one, have a subject matter expert look at the content and make a decision about what the action should be on that content. There's also the change management inside the organization. As you go through different events, whether that's just kicking off your governance program around that content and how you're going to handle it, being able to handle that initial stage of the governance process, or whether it's a change in the priorities or policies or the legislation that comes along. Maybe there's a new state legislation around privacy protection, and you have to incorporate some of those new rules into the way you handle that information. Being able to pull that in as part of your change management program around the content, around how you run your governance program, and how it fits in with the thing that you already have in place. Being able to do that lots of different ways. Sometimes it's, overarching happens for everything. Sometimes it's by sector inside your business, and sometimes it's by content type as well, right? You might find that let's say the retention period changes on a particular type of content. You need to go through and make sure that your enforcement, the action side of things, follows along with that new regulations that come through from changes outside the business. We talk a little bit about actioning as well around this tag and label stuff. We'll talk about MIP sensitivity labels in a bit. Moving content, so that is taking it from one repository to another repository, restructuring that content. Basically transforming that content as it goes, either through a number of different kinds of transformation. We talked a little bit about metadata. I talked a little bit about people adding additional metadata to content, either through gross procedures, where you say, well, I know everything in the finance folder is finance related, so it needs to be tagged in that kind of metadata way, or whether it's individual subject matter experts that are applying that metadata because they understand the content really well. Transforming could also be restructuring the content, so that taking those documents and file structures that are years and years and years old and restructuring those into something that is more functional, more feasible for operations today, into a structure that helps to make sense, is actually really, really powerful. There's many organizations, because they haven't had a governance program for documents in place, they end up with lots of convenience copies. They end up with lots of orphaned repositories where people might use something for 1 or 2 years. That grows out of fashion. People start to use a different program, different process in order to handle their information. So being able to take that information and kind of pull it all together into a structure that makes sense for the business today is a really powerful thing, to be able to restructure that content so that it fits into a repository structure that makes sense for people who need access to it now, or didn't even know that it existed before. Migrating the content, like I said before, from one repository to another. You see that a lot these days as organizations move their content off of their internal servers, whether that's network file shares or that's internal SharePoint instances, up into cloud environments like M365, SharePoint Online, Teams, that kind of thing. Being able to take that content and move it to a different platform. That probably has been driven by external forces outside of the governance side of things, where it's an IT decision or a business decision to move the content to reduce costs from an infrastructure perspective. You're looking to make sure that you can take that content. It can go through all of those other processes as well during the migration process, be restructured, added metadata, added the tagging business that we'll talk about, the M365 piece, being able to go through all of those different pieces as you move that content over from one place to another can be really beneficial for the governance side of things going forward. It really does take some input from the content owners, the people who actually have to use it on a day-by-day basis. They have to be part of that process, because if you're restructuring things and adding additional metadata and doing things like applying MIP sensitivity labels to content, you're going to be changing the way that they do your business. They're going to have a pretty strong opinion about how that transformation happens. You want to make sure that they're all part of the team, going all the way back to our governing principles. But why do we have a governance program in the first place, and what are the goals, and making sure that everybody's following in the same direction for that. So all the way down to the folks who are the end users of that content, the content owners, knowing where they can find that information, how it's going to be handled by the governance program is really important. And the last one there, I'll talk a little bit about the Microsoft 365 information protection platform. It's just inside of Microsoft's 365 environment. There's a really strong pillar that is called information protection, which is about the management and controls around documents as it lives inside of M365. And one of the really strong pieces that Microsoft has added to that MIP strategy has been this thing called security labels. And security labels are metadata that is added to documents in order to identify, so that the documents themselves can identify the value that they have to the organization, to the systems that are used to manage that content already. So every single Word document, every single PDF could have an MIP sensitivity label attached to it. So it could be a public document, or maybe it's a restricted document that contains financial information, or it's a confidential document that contains PII or tax information or something like that. The document itself, it gets modified. It has that MIP sensitivity label embedded in the file. So no matter where that file goes, it's going to have that identifier inside the document. And then as that document moves and is shared and used throughout the M365 environment, the security controls that exist in the M365 stack, so things like cloud access security brokers, MCAS is what they call theirs, or a DLP solution, or their Exchange Online solution, or even inside of SharePoint, those MIP security labels can drive those controls, those security controls on how that information gets shared, who has access to it, who's allowed to see it, where it's allowed to go. All of that kind of stuff happens through that one label that gets applied to that content. And that's certainly something that we've recognized from our discussions with our customers, and we implemented that as part of Discovery Center, is the ability to apply that metadata into those documents based on that, those facets and the extraction rules and the data modeling that we did before, as we talked about the governance piece. All of that valuable information can help drive that sensitivity classification. So is it public? Is it super duper confidential? Is it restricted? What's the classification that goes along with that content? That can be applied straight into those documents and have that added value, the support of the MIP environment, both through the metadata that's embedded in the content, as well as protection. MIP has this part that comes along with it that can apply encryption. That label that's embedded into that content then becomes part of the MIP security, or this M365 security controls all across that system, all across that platform. MIP security labels are used to drive those security controls as the information lives and breathes throughout that environment. Really powerful thing that's something to consider if you're an M365 customer, about how you can take advantage of that classification, that sensitivity label, to help protect and secure the position of that information in your information governance, and how you can figure out what those labels should be. We have one customer who was going through a program of implementing MIP in their environment, and we came along to help them out with some other concerns that they had. But we also did a little experiment with them where we identified the documents that had been labeled by their end users with MIP sensitivity labels, and then compared that with their policy and data mapping, or data modeling rules about what the classification should be for that content. And we found that the customer had not done a particularly good job of identifying what those classification rules should be to their end users. The end users were not particularly well educated in what that classification should be. I think it was something like 90% of the documents were misclassified, and most of those were classified at too low a level for the content that was actually found to be in them. So as an example, there might have been a document that had some financial routing banking information inside of it, but it was marked as public. Whereas if you actually looked at the policy rules, the data modeling that rules that they had in place for other systems, they said if it contains this value, then the classification should be something else. And Discovery Center was able to go through and say, you've got a bit of a problem here the way your end users are applying that metadata to the content. It was really interesting to see the challenges that they had, and it mostly came down to end user education and understanding of the system, and having them become more comfortable when they're creating content to choose that classifications, but then to use Discovery Center as sort of a backup to that program as the users become better at identifying classifications on their own. Having Discovery Center come in and validate that classification is being done properly, that the information is being stored with the correct metadata labels inside of their file center, file stores, and SharePoint Online environments. Really interesting program that was. 365. Whew, it's a big topic. It is extremely popular these days for folks to talk about migrating their content to Microsoft 365. Microsoft 365 is a big environment. It has lots and lots of capabilities and lots of functionality that's built into it. There are a number of challenges when it comes to embracing that as your storage mechanism, right? So M365 is lots of different things. One of the things that it can be is your SharePoint environment can be stored there, your Teams environment can be stored there. So it turns into a repository for content. And organizations that are looking to move to 365, embracing the whole cloud experience from Microsoft, it is really what's the word I'm looking for? Inviting to just take everything that already exists and move it over and say, great, we're done with the migration. We're in the cloud now, moving on, going forward. And I think most folks would agree that if you are going to move from one house to another, when you sell your house and you move into something brand new house, you probably don't want to move everything that you've found. You don't pack everything up blindly and just move it on over. You don't. The word we use in the industry is lift and shift. It's right there on the screen. Avoid lifting and shifting. I didn't even know that was on the screen. I should read what I'm showing. It's very true in the migrations to M365 world. You don't have to empty out all of the cupboards and all of the shelves and put it into the moving truck and bring it into M365. Most of organizations have years and years and years of, frankly, bad behavior of storing information, either misclassifying it into the wrong repositories, storing it beyond the usefulness or beyond the risk tolerance of the organization, and that information should be validated before you actually migrate it. So making sure that you go through that content, looking at what you can get rid of, a little bit like I said before about making sure you clean up all that rot stuff before you do your migration piece, making sure that the structures make sense in your brand new home inside the cloud, that it's easy for end users and business owners, content owners, to find the information that they're looking for, that it makes sense for the business as it exists today and how it's going to look in the future in the M365 land. So making sure you go through some kind of a cleanup process, maybe a restructuring of that information, and then maybe looking at taking advantage of that MIP data classification piece in order to secure the content strictly from an IT security perspective, having those security controls take advantage of that. So clean up the data, make it nice and shiny and brand new. Make sure you're only bringing over the information that's really important to you in that new space, and managing the stuff that you're leaving behind as you decommission those other kinds of servers that are on site, and making sure that the information that you have is valuable, that you're getting rid of the stuff that you don't need. Being able to protect the content that you have, there's lots of different strategies that are very helpful in this space about what you're trying to accomplish, how you migrate your information, how you do your content storage across M365. There's lots of different ways that you can store information in that environment, how you stand that up. That's going to have a lot to do with the way your business works. I don't think that there's a single particular tool or methodology that works really well there for every organization. I think you have to really look at how the business understands their data, how they do their work, and understand how they want to have that information stored for them. That doesn't mean they get the final decision on it. In fact, your IT and your IT security folks probably have quite a lot to say about how that information gets stored and managed inside of M365. But I think you also want to consider what the end users and the business data owners care about that as you move that stuff forward. There's the interesting ideas around endpoint security and user monitoring that exists within the 365 environment. So there's lots of behavioral analytics stuff. There's the MCAS or the CASB kinds of solutions where you're looking at who can have access to what kind of information, where they can have access from, right? So I may be the CEO of the organization, but that doesn't mean that I get to access everything from my phone, for example. You might have rules on, well, you can access this type of information when you're connected with a VPN. You can use that kind of information when you're accessing it from your phone or from your laptop. Very different kinds of policies that are around that. All of those tools built inside of M365, and a lot of that is driven around that idea of data classification and where this information is stored and who can have access to it and when. Those can be some very long and convoluted kinds of discussions that you get into when you pull in the end users and you pull in IT and you pull in IT security. But it's very important, I think, with this in the back of everybody's head is it's in the cloud. I should be able to access it from wherever and whenever I might happen to be in my daily business life, and having particular rules based on what that content is and understanding what the value of that is to the organization, and then having policy rules around how you gain access to it. Really interesting conversations to have with customers in that space about how they want to do those kinds of things. Mostly it's the customer, the organizations talking to themselves, the different different stakeholders getting inside the room together and talking about how they want to handle it. But then being able to use a tool like Discovery Center in order to set things up so that you can get the content into the M365 environment in a way that makes sense in order to meet the goals in that space. This is a little bit just a sort of like how did we get to this point, right? Being able to fall back to your policies and understanding how those policies are going to affect the particular operations that you have inside your business, right? There's definitely going to be some different levels of actions that you're going to want to take, the sort of strategic things, the big important. How do you re-architect the business in order to handle the particular questions of the day when it comes to the information governance kinds of things, where how are you going to take these tools that we have in order to answer the questions that might come from stakeholders and like it says there, external regulators. So dealing with those sort of very broad, general strategic goals inside the organization about how do you deal with that kind of stuff and how do you answer those questions, having the information governance platform, which uses that as the basis for where it gets to. All of the decisions have to point back to that and make a good representation of why you've chosen particular things in order to support that. Certainly helps to answer the questions when it comes to the board level kinds of discussions or talking to regulators or legislators about how you handle the information that's inside the organization. And then coming down to the sort of operational discussions about how do you handle things like breaches, or how do you handle things like requests for information on particular types of content, or if there's specific questions that come through to handle how this information gets handled, or if there's changes in the business about how do you deal with that kind of stuff. Having an information governance program clearly is going to help you to be able to answer the questions that come up from that kind of a perspective. And then there's the ability to handle those immediate kinds of questions, the tactical stuff. How do you handle the review process? How do you handle the ongoing evaluation of where you're at for a particular program or the information governance in general. How do you make sure you have those reports on a regular basis? How you be able to, when questions come up about particular content, or if there's a change in the things that you're looking for, how do you answer those questions when you do that on a repository where a particular legislation is changed? How do you get that feedback out of the hands, or out of the brains, out of the gray matter of the SMEs when they need to be able to respond to those kinds of questions? How do you review that content? How do you answer the questions as they come through from the business on a day-to-day basis? Information governance program built around file analysis and having those data maps, having that data model, having those data maps, the content maps really can help to answer the questions that come from the sort of different levels of the business, the strategic, the tactical, operational kinds of stuff. You have all of those things in place. You're able to answer those questions much more quickly if you have the program in place with tools that help you to answer those questions, and they're looking for those things on a regular basis, on a daily basis. This kind of falls into how do you get to an ongoing business. And I talked a little bit about the policy drives the business, can drive the IT stuff. Their content comes from new places. The questions come from new places. And that happens all the time. The policies, hopefully they don't change too often, but they certainly do change. The business changes on a yearly basis. IT seems to change on a daily basis. You get new requests for storage locations. You get new requests from parts of the business that need to answer regulatory questions, those kinds of things. That's a continuous thing, always happens. And you need to be able to answer those questions so you can go through that. All of the business process that we talked about before, the program process of building an inventory, cleaning up the content, building a model, classifying the content, migration if it's necessary, and reporting on that becomes a continuous thing. It's not just a do it once and you're done. Information governance is not a place. It's not a point on a map. It is a state of being. And it's the kind of thing where you have to continuously work on it. You have to be able to answer the questions as the business changes, as the IT environment changes, as you get those questions from the outside world, from regulatory, from other business partners about how you're handling that content, how you're handling that. So it turns into something that's a regular, repeatable function. You have to have the tools that are going to be able to do that for you. I think that's an important thing to instill at the beginning of any kinds of discussions like this. It's not a place that you will end up. It is a goal that is an ongoing program, not a particular project. A very different way of looking at things than a lot of sort of IT-ish kind of programs, projects. Oh, where do you start? A lot of stuff to handle and to think about. We certainly think that there's value in sitting down with the business, understanding where the goals are. I think I talked about that quite a bit. Being able to understand how you can assess the tools that are available to you and using those tools for smaller, low impact kinds of assessment capabilities, right? So that's not just to assess the tools that you might be looking to purchase or to be able to use for your program, but also to look at what your process looks like. Are we understanding our policies properly? Are we understanding our IT infrastructure properly? Have we got the right people in the room when we're making these decisions? All of that becomes sort of a test when you take it in small to make sure that all the pieces line up, that all the gears are engaged, that all of the tools that you're looking at answer the questions that you need to have. It's an information governance program does not turn overnight. It's not something that you eat all at once. It's a process that you go through. You build it slowly, making sure that you get all the bits and pieces lined up. You get the right people involved. You get the right tools involved. That you have all of the ducks lined up in a row to make sure that you're all headed in the right direction. If M365 is part of your environment, making sure that you understand how the tools that are available to you there can help you where they fall short, because there are certainly some gaps in the way that those tools work, and making sure that you understand that there are solutions other than just M365, that not everything lives and breathes inside that environment. And then making sure that when you get all of that sort of worked through, that as you take those chunks off of the elephant, as you try to eat the elephant, as the saying goes, that you go through that process on a regular basis, making sure you have those checks in place, that you know that the tools that you're using line up well, that the people that you're talking to for each of the different steps in your governance program are working well, that you have a policy that works, that's living, breathing. You have tools that are living and breathing and continue for you as you go forward, and that the process continues to work. It's never going to be written in stone. It's going to be something that continuously changes. There's always going to be changes in business, changes in IT, changes in how you need to handle information governance as you go forward. So it's not written in stone as you move along. So that's most of the things I had to say. I'm going to look to see if Marissa's still in the room somewhere. We'll talk a little bit about ActiveNav and who we are. I think you got that.
Sure. Yep. Briefly, I can cover that. I am still in the room, and I will not forget the marketing fluff. I heard that, and I won't forget it. If you're not familiar with ActiveNav, we are, as Andrew has mentioned, a software provider. And with our softwares, organizations can, as it says, map, clean, classify, quarantine, and delete all of that sensitive and redundant, obsolete, trivial, raw data. So we won't spend too much time on this. Andrew, if you want to go to the next slide that has your headshot again, we'll go on to the questions. And we did have a couple come in, and feel free to keep submitting them as we come to the end of the session here. But first, we will start with this one that says Microsoft keeps updating records keeping features as they update many other things. How relevant are the records keeping add-ons?
Oh, that's Microsoft is continuously changing. That's part of the joy of being in the cloud, right? You're on the bleeding edge of everything. I think it's a challenge to keep on top of that. It's important to understand the gaps that they have when it comes to their approach to records keeping. I think the biggest thing to think about is that that's not their goal. That's not why they live and breathe. It's not why they develop their products. It's not where they started from. They're almost always playing catch up with a lot of these functionalities and the features that they're introducing. I'm not saying that they're bad. I'm just saying that it's not really where they started. It's not really where they're going. So I think it's important to keep an eye on where their products are and where their service offerings are. But if you're looking at particular solutions for particular goals in your organization, you want to make sure that you look at something other than just Microsoft. Microsoft is very good at providing half the answer to many things, but it's almost never going to be their primary goal to be any particular IT solution in an environment. It is a little bit of a challenge to say that sometimes, because Microsoft does do a good job on many things, but you have to be a little bit careful about just accepting their environment for things. I've seen customers do that where they say, well, Microsoft has an offering in this space and we'll just use theirs. They get sort of 3/4 of the way down the road, and they realize that Microsoft has abandoned a particular technology or a particular part of their business, and they've focused on other things. They've been pretty good at doing that. They sort of get 80% of the way there, and then move along to other things. Sometimes it's better to look for vendors who are focused on the particular area that you're looking for. I think that probably answers that.
All right, fantastic. So on to the next. We have someone asking about reports and other ways to extract what governance exists across structures.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Sure. So is there a way to, start considering how you can get reports or other ways to extract what governance currently exists across different structures? So M365 or whatever.
Yeah, so it's there's a lot of the solutions that are in place tend to be sort of siloed about how they look at the content, right? So there'll be a governance structure for a particular type of repository, or there'll be a governance structure for a particular type of content or a particular application. And it's very rare to see something that is a solution across different repositories. We've spent a lot of time working with our partners around the idea of how do you connect to different repositories to get that content out. And that has been a challenge, to look for the different governance governance pieces in that, it can also be a challenge. Some of that stuff is stored in the metadata in those particular repositories. So you'll see that sometimes in SharePoint, people will have extended the governance pieces to be particular fields in SharePoint, for example, and other repositories have similar kinds of things, but it's very hard to get a single view of what the governance policies, the governance procedures might be across those different repositories. It's a real challenge because they don't care. SharePoint doesn't care about what content server uses or doesn't care about what Jira uses. There's very little commonality across that in terms of a governance policy procedures, policy perspective for that. It is understandably difficult, and that's where you have to start talking to your SMEs and your IT infrastructure to understand what policies they've put in place in order to sort of round out what you're doing in different kinds of parts of the business, I think. Challenging.
Absolutely. Like you said earlier, tons of things to think about, and you've given our audience a lot of things to think about as well. So Andrew, thank you. To our audience, thank you for attending. As we wrap up here, there is Andrew's contact information here, and you can always, of course, reach us on our website. But again, thank you, Andrew. Thank you to our audience, and we hope that you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon.